All right, y'all can have a seat. Week three of True Gospel versus Counterfeits. We've been walking through Paul's letter to the Galatians so far. We have finished chapter 1, and today we're kicking off in chapter 2. If you have missed any of the previous weeks, I would encourage you to go to our website at First Baptist Crane and listen to any of the previous messages. It's always fun to check into the middle of a story and not know the beginning of it. So definitely, if you've missed any weeks, go check it out. We have been talking about the true gospel and how if we understand the true gospel, then we will be able to identify any of the counterfeits that Satan brings. We don't need to spend a lot of time trying to figure out and understand the ins and outs of all the counterfeits. All we need to focus on is the gospel. And that's really what Paul is encouraging the Galatians to do, is to just focus on the gospel and not get caught up in all of the other stuff. What we're going to look at is chapter 2, verse 1, if you want to start there. And what he talks about in the very first verse is kind of a summary statement. He says, "Then after 14 years, I went up to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking Titus along with me." So what I want to do here is just kind of set the scene, give you a timeline. If any of you guys are timeline people, then I want to kind of set a timeline for you so you understand. We talked about how anytime you read through Paul's letters, it's also important to read through Acts as well, because Acts is the story of the early church history. And so as you're kind of reading through Galatians, you'll also be following along in Acts as well. So there's a couple different ideas on this, and I'm not going to get into all the different ideas on the timeline. I'm just going to tell you the one that I think is the most logical to me, and we'll kind of roll from there. So in 32 AD, Jesus Christ died, was buried, resurrected, and then he ascended back into heaven. Shortly after, we don't know exactly how long after, but shortly after was when Paul was converted on the road to Damascus. We talked about that in Acts chapter 9. So 32 AD is kind of our launching point. 3 years later, it talked about in chapter 1 that Paul was gone for 3 years. He went to Asia, he went to, Arabia, and then he went to Damascus. So you had 3 years to that. So basically, what we talked about last week in chapter 1 was AD 34. It's when he went to Jerusalem, and he met with Cephas, who is Peter, and he met with James, Jesus' brother. Remember that from last week? We talked about that. So then, as we jump into this chapter, it talks about 14 years later. So 14 years from when Paul was converted in 32, we're now in 45 AD. And in 45 AD is where we're going to read from today. This is when Paul will go to Jerusalem, and he will speak with all the apostles this time about all the amazing stuff that God has been doing in the Gentiles. And he's also going to talk about a famine that is going on throughout the world. Not long after this meeting that we're going to read about today, Paul will go on his first missionary journey. And this is when he will go and he will plant the churches of Galatia. We talked about how this letter to the Galatians is about multiple churches. It went to multiple churches, not just one church like Corinthians or Ephesians or Philippians. Those letters went to a specific church. The church of Galatia were multiple churches that this letter would go to. Quickly, as we learned in chapter 1, after Paul went to the churches of Galatia, he converted people, he planted churches. People were coming from Jerusalem that were Judaizers. These were Christian Jewish legalists who wanted to add to the gospel primarily circumcision, but then also the rituals, the dates, the celebrations of the Old Testament. So this is all happening in a rapid form. Right after that, Paul will be writing this letter to Galatians. It's probably in the late 40s to early 50s. We don't have an exact date for the book, but late 40s to early 50s is when we know that this was written, this book of Galatians. We can time it up with Acts chapter 11. So if you want to read Acts chapter 11, that will pair up with about the time that Galatians was written as well. And then finally, in Acts 15, the First Jerusalem Council is convened, and they clarify and put to rest the issue of circumcision. That Gentiles do not have to be circumcised. Salvation is by grace through faith alone. So that kind of gives you a timeline of what's going on. And so when you read, then after 14 years, you know that we're talking now in the 40s of when Paul went back to Jerusalem with Barnabas. Now, Barnabas is a very interesting character in the Bible. There's very little written about Barnabas, but he is one of the most influential people in the early church. And so hopefully, as you hear about Barnabas here, it can encourage you, because maybe you're not the most outspoken, extroverted person. Maybe you're the introvert that likes to do a lot of stuff behind the scenes. And I want to encourage you that God can use you just as much as the person who's the extrovert that likes to be up front, do all the talking. You have just as big a role in the kingdom of God as anyone. So Barnabas, he was born on the island of Cyprus, which is in the Mediterranean. And most likely, he became a Christian at Pentecost. So that's a really cool thing, that he was one of the very first Christians at Pentecost. He was a Levite. So if you know about the Levites, they were the ones that were the priests. They took care of the temple and everything in the Old Testament. And so he was more than likely a teacher of the law. That's who he was. He was not one of the 12 original apostles, but he was an apostle. Remember, we talked about an apostle means an sent one. And so he was one of the early people that the Church of Jerusalem sent to start churches. And he was actually Paul's mentor. During the first missionary journey that Paul would go on, Barnabas was right there with his side. He was actually the one that brought Paul into the church and gave him credibility. Because if you remember from chapter 1, a lot of the early Christians were scared of Paul. They knew all about his history and how he had killed Christians. And so Barnabas was kind of the one that helped solidify his name so that people would listen to Paul, because they were still scared of him until Paul gave him some credibility. And so he goes with him on his first missionary journey. Barnabas was with him, obviously, when he spoke and planted the churches of Galatia. Now, when Paul was getting ready to go on his second missionary journey, he and Barnabas had some pretty strong disagreements. And they were about Barnabas' cousin, John Mark. See, John Mark was with them on the first missionary journey as well, but he bailed. Right before it got really tough, John Mark would bail on Paul. And so when it was time for the second missionary journey, Paul didn't want John Mark to come, but Barnabas did. And so there was a stark disagreement between Paul and Barnabas, so much so that they went their separate ways. Now, the really cool thing about this is that God uses disagreements. God uses what we would say is a bad situation for his glory. And what would happen is Barnabas would go with John Mark and would go start churches as well. So without that disagreement, there wouldn't be churches that were planted. God used a bad situation, a disagreement, for his glory to expand his kingdom. And who is John Mark? John Mark's the guy that would write the Gospel of Mark. So all of this plays in to God's ultimate purpose. Now later on, Barnabas, Paul, John Mark, all of them would reconcile and all for the glory of God. But it's really interesting how throughout Barnabas' life, his name means son of encouragement. He was the ultimate encourager for Paul. He was the ultimate encourager for John Mark and for many, many thousands of people who would come to know the gospel because of Barnabas. But yet, there's probably only about a dozen verses in the whole Bible that talk about him at all. Now, how many of you would say, I have the gift of encouragement? Does anybody have that gift here? Anybody? You can raise your hand. It's okay. Yeah? Nobody? Arden, your encourager? All right. If you need to hang out with somebody, hang out with Arden. Because I'm telling you, if you have somebody that's an encourager in your life, that's a big deal. So if you know some encouragers, if you work with some, bring them. Let's get this church full of encouragers. That would be awesome to have. In verse 2, Paul goes on, he said, I went up because of a revelation and sat before them, though privately because those who seemed influential, the gospel that I proclaimed amongst the Gentiles in order to make sure that I was not running or had run in vain. You see, Paul received a message. He was busy. We talked about earlier, he did not go to Jerusalem the first time in 34 to meet with Cephas and James because they needed to add anything to him. He had gotten direct revelation from Jesus himself on the gospel. So he didn't need to go meet with the apostles to get any type of clarification on his theology or anything like that. So Paul was busy planting churches, converting people, but he received a revelation to go to Jerusalem this time, 14 years later. Now, we don't know. A revelation is when God speaks to you. It's typically either through a dream or through a vision, which is when you're awake. We don't know how he received this revelation. All we know is that he received a revelation that told him to go to Jerusalem. And Paul wanted to go to Jerusalem to make sure that they were clear about the gospel, because Jerusalem was full of people that wanted to add to the gospel. This is what the whole first chapter was about. They were trying to discredit Paul's authority, and they were trying to add to it. And we talked about Jesus plus nothing is the gospel. It's not Jesus plus circumcision, Jesus plus baptism, Jesus plus giving, Jesus plus anything. Nothing is the gospel except for Jesus himself. Jesus plus nothing is the gospel. And so Paul wanted to go and to sit down with the apostles to make sure everybody was on the same page. Because how many of you know that when there are disagreements in the church, it's devastating? It's devastating when there are arguments and disagreements inside of the church. And so Paul wanted to make sure. I'll tell you this. Growing up, I've been involved in multiple different denominations. Like, I grew up in the Methodist church. When I first went to college, I went to a church that you would now categorize as charismatic. Then I went to a Bible church. Then I went to a Baptist church. And how many of you know that if you go to some of these different churches, there's some stuff that's different? Yeah, I mean, we did communion. You know how many different ways churches do communion? Like, there are churches where you come up and there is a loaf of bread and a cup. And you tear a piece off and you eat it, you take the cup and you drink it. And the next person comes up, they tear another piece, and they drink out of that same exact cup you just did. All right? Catholics, yeah. There's also people that will come, they'll tear the bread off, and they'll dip it in the cup, and then they'll eat it. There are people that do what we do. There are people that have communion stations throughout the building, and you go and you do it yourself. There are prepackaged communion. There are live communion. There's unleavened bread. There is grape juice. There is wine. There's a lot of differences. There's a lot of differences in the style of music that we do. Some churches do hymns. Some churches have rock and roll church. Some churches have something in the middle. Some people have lights and lasers and smoke. Some people are very liturgical, very conservative. There's a lot of differences, and that's okay. All right? Hear me. It's okay. What's important is the gospel. If another church does something a little bit different than us, as long as we have the gospel, we're good. Do I need to say it again? Just to make sure everybody hears this. The gospel is what's important. Not all the secondary stuff. Now, there's things that we can disagree about, and that's fine. But we can work with people and do stuff together if we have the gospel correct. And so that's why Paul wanted to go to meet with the apostles, is to make sure that what he was doing with the Gentiles was what they were doing with the Jews. Because the last thing he wanted was for there to be division amongst the apostles. And for Peter to be doing one thing and him to be doing another thing. Now, how he reached Gentiles was different than how Peter would reach Jews. But the gospel was what held them together. So that's why he went there. In verse 3, he presses the issue a little bit more. It says, "But even Titus, who was with me, was not forced to be circumcised, though he was a Greek." So Titus was a Greek, he was a convert, and he would become a great leader in the church of Crete. But as a Greek, he was a Gentile. He was not circumcised. So Paul is bringing him to Jerusalem to meet before the apostles and all the Jewish leadership in the area. And a lot of those people were the Judaizers who had been preaching you had to be circumcised. You ever known somebody who just likes to step in it? Paul liked to step in it. He had no fear because he knew what he was talking about was from God himself. And so he brings him to the church in front of the apostles and all the Judaizers with Titus. Here's my boy Titus, and he's not circumcised. Now, for those of you who don't know the background of circumcision, circumcision was something that God appointed to Abraham in Genesis 17, verses 9 through 14. Now, Abraham, was he a Jew or a Gentile? He was a Gentile. Abraham was not a Jew. So God came to Abraham and said, in order for you to be part of my people, all of you got to be circumcised. All right, all you guys, the cringe factor as an adult, being circumcised. But circumcision for the Old Testament was a sign of whether you were inside of the covenant family of God or you were outside of the covenant family. So anytime somebody wanted to be a part of Israel, they had to be circumcised. But Abraham, the very first one, wasn't a Jew. This was a Gentile that was circumcised. Circumcision isn't a big deal today, thankfully. And quite honestly, for Paul, it wasn't a big deal either. The issue wasn't circumcision. The issue was, what are we adding to the gospel? Think about it today. I know for a lot of you, you're like, whatever, circumcision means nothing. I want you to think about it in this context. Texans. What's the biggest, most passionate thing that Texans have? Guns. Guns. If anybody even hints at taking away Texans' guns, they get riled up, right? If you're a politician and there's even a whiff of it, you instantly have lost Texas. Texans are passionate about guns. Now, I don't care anything about guns. That doesn't matter to me. Fine. But it's a passionate thing, right? So that was Paul's whole point, is these Judaizers were passionate about circumcision. So when Paul brought Titus, who was not circumcised, to the apostles, this was a big deal. Does that make sense? If I compare it to Texans and guns, does that understand how big a deal we're talking about here? This was a big deal. And so when the apostles didn't force him to be circumcised. That was a game changer right there. Game changer in the church. The apostles acknowledged that salvation was by grace through faith in Jesus Christ alone. And that would lead to Acts 15, where the church would make a decree about circumcision being gone. So this was the prelim to that. So this was a big deal. But then he continues on in verse 4, in understanding this, but yet because of false brothers secretly brought in, who slipped in to spy out our freedom that we have in Christ Jesus, so that they might bring us into slavery. Throughout this book, you've noticed that Paul has talked to them in a familial term. In chapters 1, he calls them brothers. Here, he says false brothers, because these were people that had slipped into the church that were not Christians, that were trying to add to it. And so he is calling them out. Right now, the big news story resides right on the border of Russia and the Ukraine. Any time now, there could be a massive war go on. And what Russia has been doing for months, if not years, is they have been sending in spies to Ukraine to try to uproot and destroy the government so that it's easier for them to take over. This is exactly the type of thing that Paul is talking about that these false brothers were doing to the church. They were sliding into the church, trying to pretend like they are one of them, only to add slavery upon them. Just like the Russians would love to take the Ukrainians as slaves, the gospel frees us from slavery, but these people were trying to put the people in slavery. In Acts 15, they would say, some of the men came down from Judea and were teaching the brothers, unless you are circumcised according to the customs of Moses, you can't be saved. So they were saying, unless you follow the Old Testament law, you can't be saved. Jesus can't even save you unless you do this as well. That was putting them in bondage, in slavery. We talked about how the gospel frees us. It brings joy. It gets rid of guilt. It gets rid of pressure. All the things that we feel when we have to live up to God in order for him to be happy with us. The gospel frees us of all of that. We can live our lives with peace and joy, knowing that Jesus has done it for us already. And so Paul is calling them out to that. And he says in verse 5, to them we did not yield in submission even for a moment, so that the truth of the gospel might be preserved for you. You see, Paul knew he had a fight, and he was ready to go. He was ready to go 9 rounds with these guys. For some of you, there's stuff that you're willing to fight for. You probably are willing to fight for your families. You're willing to probably fight for your home, maybe your job. But the question that Paul would have for you, the question I have for you today is, are you willing to fight for the truth of the gospel? Is it important enough to you, the truth of the gospel, that you're willing to fight for it, to preserve it, to not allow the creepings of Satan into your life that says, you know what, you're just not good enough. You know what, today you didn't read your Bible, so God's really upset with you. You know what, you didn't do all the things that you know you're supposed to do, and so you're not really who God wants you to be. All those things that Satan creeps into your life, all those things he puts in your head, he wants you enslaved. He wants you in bondage. But the gospel frees you to know that Jesus paid it all. And that is the beauty of the gospel. And so they didn't even yield for a moment to the thought of being put in bondage. And he says in verse 6, and from those who seem to be influential, what they were makes no difference to me. God shows no partiality. Those, I say, who seemed influential added nothing to me. Pastor and theologian John Stott writes about this verse alone. He says, although Paul accepted their office as apostles, he is not in awe of their person as it was being inflated by the Judaizers. Remember, that was kind of their thing in chapter 1 is the Judaizers had come to the people in Galatians and said, well, Paul is not one of the 12. He's trying to create his own thing. He wants to build up his own name. And so this was Paul taking a direct shot right at the Judaizers by telling them that I have just as much influence because God spoke to me. These people are no greater. They're just like me. Paul didn't come seeking their correction, but he wanted to be accepted and to receive their embrace for the gospel purposes. You see, the Judaizers, they wanted to add to it. We've got the Olympics coming up here pretty soon. We got any Olympics fans? Anybody like the Olympics? All right. I personally like the summer more than the winter, but it's okay. I will watch as well. So let me give you an analogy to kind of understand what the Judaizers wanted for these people to do. In the Olympics, if you win, you get a gold medal. It's the most valuable thing out there to win an Olympic gold medal. Can you imagine if on the podium they have just put the gold medal over a figure skater's neck? And they said, thank you for my gold medal. Do you have any bronze around that I could dip my gold medal into? How foolish would that be? Like, you're taking the most precious, priceless thing, an Olympic gold medal, and you want to dip it in bronze. That's exactly what the Judaizers wanted them to do. You have the gold medal. If you are a Christian saved by Jesus Christ, you have the gold medal. Don't dip it in bronze. Don't dip it in bronze. A lot of you want to. A lot of you want to dip it in bronze. Don't. Accept the gold medal. Run with the gold medal. Savor the gold medal. Hang it up. Display it for your friends, for your family. I have a gold medal. Jesus saved me. I don't need bronze. That's what Paul's telling them. Don't settle for anything less than the best. And on the contrary, in verse 7, when they saw that I had been entrusted with the gospel to the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been entrusted with the gospel to the circumcised, for he who worked through Peter for his apostolic ministry to the circumcised worked also through me for mine to the Gentiles. And when James and Cephas and John, who seemed to be pillars, perceived the grace that was given to me, they gave the right hand of fellowship to Barnabas and me, that we should go to the Gentiles and they be circumcised. This right hand of fellowship was more than just a handshake. The right hand of fellowship meant full embrace. What they were saying is that the gospel that Paul teaches to the Gentiles is the true gospel that the Jews need as well. This was a full embrace of Paul's ministry. One of the main critics that the Jews has is that he did not have the full embrace of the 12. And so right here, he's talking about they fully embraced me. As a church, we need to hold tight to the gospel. You're going to hear that a whole lot here. But the other things, the secondary things, we can have some freedom in. There's a church in the DFW area called the Village Church. Maybe some of you have heard of it. Matt Chandler's the pastor out there. I remember going to the Village Church, and they were probably less than 10 years old at that point. When Matt came to the Village Church, they were a small church, not much bigger than probably we were, and primarily older congregation, and they knew that they needed revitalization. And Matt told them that in order for that to happen, things would have to change. And they said, yes, we understand that. Very much like when I met here with the search committee here, we had these same conversations. So I was sitting in the audience at this one particular service, and Matt was talking about the history of the church, now with multiple thousands of people. But the thing that struck me about that conversation was he had all of the original people that were still living from when he started Stand Up. And he recognized them. And he said, what you see today is only possible because of these people standing today. Because they were willing to sacrifice their preferences for the greater good to reach more people for the gospel. You see, in our church and in every church, all of us have our preferences. Every one of you has a preference on what you think should happen. You know how I know this? Because I could go and I could do a seating chart where each one of you sit every Sunday already. If next Sunday somebody was sitting in your seat, you'd be like, that's my seat. What are you doing? That's where I sit. Get up. And this person's like, I just came to hear the gospel. God, come on. But we all have our preferences. We have our preferences on music. We have our preferences on preaching style. We have our preferences on the color of the walls, the colors of the carpet, whether we have pews or whether we have chairs, whether we have big screens, whether we have little screens. Everybody has their own preferences. But none of that stuff matters compared to the Gospels. So I just want to tell you guys that it has been so amazing how you guys have embraced the things that we've done so far. There will be more changes. What? I don't know. When? I don't know. But I can tell you that what we're going to do is to further the gospel message. It's not to make a name for First Baptist Crane. It's not to make a name for ourselves, but it's to reach more people with the gospel. That's what Paul cared about. It doesn't matter all the intricacies of how we go about it, whether we have hymns, whether we have rock music, whether we do ESV version or whether we do King James version. None of that stuff matters. What matters is that we all hold on to the things that are important, the gospel, like this, and the other things like this, so that we can tell more people about Jesus. And hopefully 10, 20 years from now, we can do the same thing. And we can talk to the people that are sitting throughout here and go, you know why this is happening? It's because the people who are sitting here today said, you know what? I've got an open hand to some things because we need to reach more people for Jesus. That's my prayer. That's my hope. What that will look like, I have no idea. But my prayer is that we have so many people in here that are meeting Jesus because you said that's more important than anything else that we do. And that was Paul's heart. That was Paul's heart. He says, I became this for these people. I became this for these people because I want to reach them for the gospel. And he closes out these verses. In verse 10, the apostle said, only they asked us to remember the poor, the very thing which we are eager to do. See, this was a request to remember the church of Jerusalem. The church of Jerusalem was exploding with growth. And how many of you know when a church explodes with growth, there's a lot of needy people that come to a church? It's the hurt, the weak. Those people are drawn because Jesus is beautiful. And so that's what they were reminding Paul is, as you go and you preach throughout the countries and throughout the areas, don't forget about the needy. And that's what I hope for our church as well. We're going to talk tomorrow night. I have a meeting with the missions team. And we're going to talk about ways that our church can be more engaged in the community and helping the needy. But it starts right here in our church, helping the people in our church as well. One of the ways that that happens is through everybody participating and giving. I know you're like, oh gosh, here we go. But here's the truth. In the Old Testament, God commanded them to give. The commandment in the Old Testament was 10%. and that was the first 10%. So in modern day vernacular, pre-tax. That was the role in the Old Testament. Now, if you look in the Old Testament at what they really gave, it was well more than 10%. If you look at what they gave, anytime they called and they said, hey, we need to build the temple, we're talking about people, they've done the numbers that they gave 50, 60% of their income to build the temple. But God said 10%. That's what the word tithe means, 10%. In the New Testament, there's not a command on 10%. It says to give generously. What that is, that's up to your discretion. But God wants you to give generously. As a follower of Christ, this is about building the kingdom. It's not about building a name for First Baptist. And so what we want to do is we want to give generously to further the gospel message, to further the kingdom. And so I want to just encourage you as we wrap up, if you're a part of what we're doing, if you're a partner, if you're a member, if you care about what we're doing here, I want to challenge you to talk with your families, pray about it, and to figure out how you can give generously. Every one of us give generously so that we can do some amazing things in our children's ministry, in our student ministry, in our adult ministries, in our service to the community, in our service to international missions. We have a lot of things that we feel called by God to do, and we need everybody to be a part of that, to give generously. It's what the early church commanded. It's what God commands throughout the New Testament. So I want to challenge you to pray with your families about how you can be a part of that and give generously, because God has given generously to us. He has given us freedom. He has given us where we don't have to live by the law anymore, where we don't have to feel condemned. We don't have to feel like God is mad at us, but we live our lives in gratitude for what He's done for us. We're going to sing in worship to God for His freedom, for His grace. I want you to stand and sing as loud as you can. During that time, if you need prayer, come pray. You can pray in your seats however you want. But let's sing, thanking God for all He has done and how gracious He is to us.